Okay, when we left off last time, we had left with the death of Lenin and the rise of Joseph Stalin. And in particular, Stalin's effort to, as he saw it, complete the socialist revolution, to complete the work that Lenin had begun. Lenin had, shall we say, a change of heart about Stalin in the early 1920s. Lenin originally thought Stalin was quite useful, but then he worried that Stalin was perhaps a little bit too violent, that Stalin's methods showed him to be a little bit unstable and a little bit dangerous. Lenin died, and Stalin maneuvers his way into power, ultimately exiling Trotsky, who dies in 1940, assassinated by Soviet agents in Mexico. Stalin, one of the things you have to understand is, Stalin is held by some, I mentioned last time, it's still held by some very, very elderly people in Russia as having been sort of the hero. Not simply because he was the leader who won the war against the Nazis, but also because Stalin creates this enormous transformation in the Soviet economy between the middle of the 1920s and the end of the 1930s. It's also because Stalin is the beneficiary of an enormously successful propaganda campaign that presents Stalin, as I said last time, as if not a father figure, sort of a gruff, sort of well-meaning uncle. Rough around the edges, but not necessarily too refined, but someone whose heart is in the right place. Whether Stalin had a heart is something I think that's still open for debate. But this is the presentation. So you have this combination of things. Because what happens is that Stalin is going to develop the Soviet Union, especially the industrial side of the Soviet Union, rather dramatically. He's going to do so at an enormous human cost, but he is going to emerge still a very popular figure within the Soviet Union. That is, it's not simply Stalin ruling by fear. There is also a great deal of public approval of Stalin. Because on the one hand, he is building up the economy, giving some people opportunities they've never had before, and on the other hand, the propaganda is cloaking or masking what exactly is going on within the Soviet Union during Stalin's reign. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is that there's sort of Stalin operating at multiple levels, bringing about dramatic and real industrial change, bringing about dramatic and real change in many people's lives, for the better. I'm not saying for the best, but if you were a dispossessed, landless Russian peasant, or Kazakh peasant, or Georgian peasant, your life likely saw some material improvement under Stalin. If, however, you were someone who opposed Stalin, or whom Stalin felt opposed him, your life was very short and very nasty. So it's this kind of balance that we have to go on, and we have to understand why Stalin has, even today in Russia, a somewhat complicated legacy. As I mentioned at the end of last time, Stalin's big thing is to get agriculture going. Lenin had allowed peasants, people who had seized land during the Russian Revolution, to keep that land at least temporarily, he didn't tell them it was temporary, and sell their grain, sell their produce, so that the Soviet Union could export it, could create sort of a more productive agriculture, could buy goods abroad so as to industrialize. When Stalin comes in, there's a recent history of the Russian Revolution which basically says Stalin rushed things. Had Stalin continued Lenin's policies, he might have had ultimately more success without such loss of life. But Stalin is impatient. And in 1928, he inaugurates the first 5-year plan, which contains within it several important directives or several important changes to the Soviet economy. One I mentioned last time is collectivization. That is, the organization of Soviet agriculture on a massive scale, using mechanization, technology, advances in irrigation and fertilizer, all of these things, to organize the Soviet Union into Soviet agriculture into collective farms, where you would have a few people left on the land, a relative few, who would work the land with the aid of tractors and other mechanized implements, everyone else would be freed up to go work in these new industrial cities that were being created. To mine, to build tractors, to build railway engines, etc. The problem that Stalin runs into is that there is a significant group of peasants who have held on to land seized during the Russian Revolution, and they are unwilling to give it up. Stalin will call them, they don't call themselves this, but Stalin will call them kulaks. K-U-L-A-K-S. Kulaks, which literally means fists. People who are resisting or fighting. These are the kulaks here, about to be run over by the tractor. And it says here, smite the kulaks, just in case anyone didn't get the visual message here. And the kulaks are presented here, among other things, as not only sort of, rapacious, they've got fangs, they all sort of look like apes. Here's one actually literally gnawing away on his cow. And this is actually something that Stalin is and the Soviet authorities are very interested in getting across. Because when the kulaks in 1929, 1930, or the people who Stalin calls the kulaks, especially in the area called Ukraine, you may have heard of it in the news recently, they resist. They occupy some of the most fertile and productive land in the Soviet Union. They don't want to give it up. They don't want to move to cities. They don't want to lose the land that they've seized, that they feel is rightfully theirs. So there's a lot of resistance in villages in the Ukraine in particular. The resistance takes the form of challenging Stalin, not simply refusing to go to collectives, but also saying, if you're going to try to collectivize us, we're going to make your whole economic project grind to a halt. This is what the peasants in Ukraine in particular are up to. They say, we will withhold all of our grain, all of our food. Not only that, we're not going to withhold it, we're going to destroy it. Talking about playing chicken a moment ago, they're going to play chicken with Stalin, which is a terrible idea. As I said, the man who said that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic, who once was also rumored, I don't think it's actually been proven, but rumored to have said that one factory is worth a million dead Ukrainians. So you can sort of see where Stalin's coming from here. There's resistance. People burn their crops, destroy what's in their storehouses and warehouses, plow their fields under. They kill their livestock and burn the carcasses. All in this idea that they will somehow create a food crisis and Stalin will not be able to proceed with moving everybody to these new industrial cities. It does not work out that way. Several things combine to make this, let me skip ahead here for a second, to make this a terrible idea. I should show you, by the way. This is some of the propaganda about the collective farms. Usually featuring, it's sort of an interesting thing within Soviet propaganda, usually featuring women working on these collective farms. One of the things that the Soviets do in the 1920s, 1930s is they attempt to sort of redirect gender roles. Not by replacing one gender with the other in sort of a superior position, but arguing that both are partners. One of the things that under the Soviet system will happen is that divorce is liberalized. Basically, you can get a divorce just by going to an office and signing a piece of paper. It's part of a larger effort, you might say, sort of break down the family as a source of identification and replace it with the state. But it's also this belief that all must contribute, and there must be this sort of egalitarian regime. So you often see women being portrayed as the ones working in the collectives, or in some cases, leading the work in the collectives. This is always interesting to me because it says day after day life becomes even happier. I just want to know who had time in the Soviet Union to go sailing. Apparently, you're out here on the river. It's a beautiful, bucolic sort of atmosphere, and instead of riding the combine, you're just going to take your boat out for a spin. I don't know that ever happened. These are the tractors. I will come back. These are a couple of other famous images. Again, I hate this projector. You can't really see in the back here, but you've got sort of women, again, sort of taking stock. You know it's scientifically run agriculture because she's writing things down in a book. So you've got tractors, you've got, trust me, there's a combine harvester behind there. And there's also this. I mean, they went full bore in trying to sort of create this notion that the collectives were the future. This is actually a mural from the Moscow subway. Again, a woman sort of almost as though she's on the prow of a ship, piloting it through the ocean, but instead through an ocean of wheat with, again, this combine or harvester. Presenting this image of women who apparently spend a lot of time in the gym also. Sort of the proportionality has gone out the window in the Soviet realism school here. But again, it's this notion that the collective farmers are sort of pioneers. They are remaking the land for the good of the state. And that their identities are very much subsumed in their roles as sort of basically not just sort of farmers, but almost sort of engineers, technicians, who are using all this new mechanical help to make Soviet agriculture even more productive every day. As I said, you've got this all sort of propaganda, but you have a lot of resistance. And so what Stalin declares, starting in 1930 and continuing for the next couple of years, Stalin declares that basically, if there is resistance in Ukraine, then all Ukrainians are going to suffer. Ukraine is supposed to supply a certain amount of food every quarter, every year, to the Soviet economy, so that you can resettle people. What happens is that in the early 1930s, the government comes into Ukraine, where people are trying to destroy their crops. It arrests people, it kills people, and it confiscates all available food. That is, not just food on the farms that have already been collectivized, not just food that they can keep these peasants from destroying, but all food in the cities like Kiev and in the countryside. The idea is that you're going to basically starve Ukraine to feed the rest of the Soviet project. Ultimately, about 4 million Ukrainians are going to die between 1929 and 1933. And one thing you can see here, the color is not great, but in this area here, of the Ukraine in particular, you can see rate of population decline, 1929 to 33. The areas in the darkest red are where population declines by at least a quarter, if not more. Some of it is people moving to industrial cities by force, some voluntarily. Some is people who were killed in state actions and retribution. Some are people shipped off to the Gulag. A lot of them are people who die of starvation. And there are, in Ukraine at this time, reports of cannibalism, reports of people eating every creature they can possibly hunt or trap in the woods. It's massive starvation. And it's one of these things that everyone in Ukraine knows is going on, but there's a very strict sort of cap kept on the news in the Soviet Union. Even what's shown to outside journalists and outside visitors. In the early 1930s, remember, you're in a global depression. And one of the things that happens is that there emerge a couple of, what seem to some people, revolutionary ways of reordering your economy. The Nazis and the fascists have one way. The Soviets have another way. They're not the same. Wait till the next few days in which we get my lengthy discussion with you about why fascism is not socialism, despite what Sean Hannity says. There's a reason that I have a lot of degrees and he does not. But you have this sense among people outside the Soviet Union that maybe this is the way forward. And so they have these visitors, these guided tours. They'll even come to a place like Kiev in 1933, where people are literally dying in the street. And what the Soviet authorities do is they ship in a lot of people from Moscow, from other cities. They remove the bodies from the street. They cordon off about a 6-block area, and they populate it with people from other parts of the Soviet Union, people who've been eating. They bring in cars. And so they bring in these delegations and show them. They bring them to the train station in Kiev. They wander them. They walk them around this little part of Kiev, show everyone smiling and happy and sitting in cafes and all sorts of stuff like that. Train leaves, hold the stage set, back to misery and suffering in Ukraine. You can see why, to this day, Ukrainian-Russian relations are fairly tense. Ukraine has, in many ways, a different cultural base. There is a Ukrainian nationalism that Stalin was always concerned about. Different religious practices, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, not the Russian Orthodox Church, different language. What happens in the early 1930s is massive population decline. So as Stalin is moving lots of people, and lots of people are going voluntarily because they don't own land. They didn't seize land. Their lives don't seem so good. They will take the collective or they will take the move to the industrial city. But in Ukraine, the more prosperous peasants, the ones who resist Stalin, they died, and lots of other Ukrainians died. Lots of Ukrainians who support Stalin died. Because this is basically going to be collective punishment. Everyone in Ukraine must pay for what these resistors are doing. And one of the things about the reason I stress this effort to collectivize and this effort to crack down on the protests in Ukraine in particular is that it shows how much Stalin is developing a specific sort of state, one that Lenin already had put in place, but that Stalin is expanding upon. That is not only an autocratic state, but a state which is declaring that it must be the only focus of people's loyalty. I think I mentioned this last time, but one of the things that has fascinated historians of the Soviet Union is the question of why people, in the first place, seem to like Stalin. They've sort of answered that by saying it's a combination of propaganda, and if you're living in a field of muck, moving to a coal mining town was considered a step up. There's also the question, why do people fight so hard for Stalin in the Second World War? And one of the things they talk about is that during the 20s and 30s, there's a whole generation whose allegiances, whose loyalties are reoriented away from their families, away from their communities, towards the state. And you can see this happening in what goes on in Ukraine. You have the state coming in and declaring that the feeding of people in the industrial cities is paramount, the paramount interest of the state. You have the state coming in. These are soldiers removing grain that have been hidden in a hayloft in a barn in Ukraine. You also have this. This is was at times done sort of for propaganda purposes only, but it's designed to reinforce a particular message. That is, children were recruited to be informants on their parents. Children who joined what were called the pioneers or the young pioneers were recruited to basically assist the state. They were brought up in an educational system that told them the state is your priority. Your family, your village, your religion, no, the state. And that's one of the things that historians now point to when they say, why did so many people fight so hard for such an awful regime in the 1940s? First place, the Nazis were, perhaps even worse. Second, you have an entire generation raised on the idea that they must sacrifice themselves for the state. They must devote all of their energy, all of their focus to the state. And so you have a case here where children are being not just sort of asked, but basically instructed to spy on their parents. Children were rewarded with food if they turned in their parents. If their parents were hoarding grain or something out in a field. That's why they set up these little watchtowers. They didn't set up a lot of them. And it was, again, designed to sort of keep this idea that simply someone's watching you. But what's also going on here, you can see, is the breakdown of the family. That the kids are supposed to be, instead of being sort of, in the household, loyal to their parents, the kids are now actually agents of the state.
So if they told their parents, how did they survive? How did they live?
Well, they hoped that they would be sort of taken in by other families. They hoped that the state might provide for them by sending them to a collective farm. But it was no guarantee. There's a famous incident it's 1932 or 1933, where a Ukrainian boy, about 13 or 14 years old, actually turns in his father for food hoarding. And the father is executed. And the entire village basically lynches this kid. And what the Soviets do is they put up a statue of the kid in the village to sort of remind him. But Stalin is recorded, when he hears a story about this kid, he says, yes, put a statue up. But then he goes, What a little fucker. Who turns on their father? You know, but put the statue up. We want to encourage that behavior from now on. So, pardon my language, but that's Stalin. You know, I'm translating from the original Russian. Don't worry. Sorry, Zach. It might have been, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's Pavel something. Yes, I know that. I don't know the last name. But yeah, this thing where he basically turns on his family, and the village executes him. And the Soviet authorities basically, you know, put up a statue to him. But even Stalin knows, you know, that this is just, you know, Stalin still has some sort of like idea of sort of a primal loyalty to the family. This, I think, is perhaps the most terrifying image I've ever come across. In some ways, this is the children of the corn. Because what you have here, the words say, the fields won't wait. This is again about using the children. The fields won't wait. It's the kid. This was a poster found on collective farms to encourage people to get out early. You can't quite see this clearly here, but people getting into trucks to go out to the fields to work. Here's the child. Now, think about the framing. The propaganda is very deliberate, and the Soviet Union was basically the center of the global propaganda industry in the 1920s and 1930s. They refined propaganda in ways that people, to this day, have still never refined it or reached a certain level. How's this framed? What's going on here? Not only is the child saying, the fields won't wait, what else is there? Sorry? She's knocking on the kitchen window. She's looking in the house. And everyone looking at this poster, we're all in the house. And she's saying, tap, 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 tap. Fields won't wait. And again, this notion that you can't trust your family. You can't trust anyone. This is the sort of thing that the Soviet system is designed to do. It's designed to produce this, not quite paranoia, but sort of permanent distrust. One of the things that a recent account of basically a very adventurous historian decided to do an account of social and family life under Stalin. And he called his book The Whisperers. Because the idea was that, you know, if parents, adults had something they wanted to share with each other, if they wanted to talk to them, you have to whisper. Don't let the children hear, in particular. That family relations under Stalin in particular are completely screwed up. Because no one trusts anybody else. Who could be informing, who could not be informing. It's the same sort of model that the East German state will use starting after 1945. And in 1989, right about now, actually 25 years ago, some of you may not have been alive. That's a chilling thought to me. Not a chilling thought, but sort of makes me feel old. When the Berlin Wall fell, when East Germany fell, one of the things that many Germans did is they went, the East German government was so inefficient they couldn't even destroy their own records properly before it was too late. They found hundreds of thousands of files of what was called the Stasi, the secret police. And as it turned out, everybody was spying on everybody else. This is the entire thing. You know, you've got 5 family members, 3 of whom would be filing reports after dinner. And it's a crazy sort of situation. But this idea that people were always being watched is something that is a hallmark of this Stalinist regime. You know, the whole idea of Big Brother is watching you. It's not Big Brother in this sort of, 1984, there's a telescreen watching in your apartment or something like that. But it is this notion that, the kids in particular, think about how pernicious this is. If you look at every child as sort of a potential enemy. It's a crazy way to live. But it suited Stalin's purposes. It focused attention to the state. It focused attention away from other sources of loyalty. Is there a question, Dylan? Do you have them?
You answered.
I did, okay. So again, this is the kind of image that you would see throughout the Soviet state, reminding you that you were being watched. And it's very popular. That is, in propaganda, one of the things that is very popular are these images that remind you that you are not alone and that you are under surveillance at all times. In some ways, propaganda attempts to take the place, in some ways, of God. If In the medieval world, people believed that God is always watching. In the 20th century, the idea was the state, or the enemy, or some other is always watching. Similar things will be done in just about every country that fights the Second World War. They'll have all sorts of posters up reminding you that, the walls have ears, or people are listening. The British are very good at this. They would have these whole sort of posters which just showed basically wallpaper. And if you look closely at the wallpaper, it was all these little Hitlers. So be careful what you say, You never know who's listening. So again, this idea of a paramount state is what Stalin is after. So he's able to create a massive industrial state, but one that by the late 1930s, let me go back for a second and get some more Soviet propaganda. This is one of my favorites because this one says, the smoke of the factories is the breath of the state. Is sort of horrifying to think about when you realize that many of these industrial cities were thrown up in a hurry, there was no environmental concerns, and that some of these places are now, to this day, enormously dangerous places to live. Levels of things like lead and arsenic in the water. Average lifespan in these industrial towns is low even by Russian standards. But these are designed to produce. You produce, you produce, you produce. That's what the Soviet state was all about. How you get there. Remember, this is Stalin, someone who's come up under Lenin, Lenin for whom the ends always justify the means. So, for Stalin, you get to this massive industrial capacity. You get to this massive state. How you get there? Well, slave labor, gulags, huge migration of people, the forced starvation of millions. It's a process that, if you are the beneficiary of it, you think that Stalin is fantastic. If you are not the beneficiary of it, you are likely dead, and therefore not thinking anything's on Stalin. This is a state, pardon me as I go back one, no, sorry. These are tractor factories. This is the tractor factory in Chelyabinsk, which was sort of the centerpiece of the early part of industrialization. This is a place called Magnitogorsk, which looks a lot like this today. This is a picture. Life magazine came in the 1930s to take pictures and say, oh, maybe this is the way forward. It turned out really not to be. But you have a remaking of the Soviet Union completely. You go from this peasant, populated, agriculturally dominated society to this massive industrial society in less than a generation. Now, there's some issues with how Stalin runs this state. That is, Stalin is, as I said, someone for whom the ends always justify the means. Stalin is also someone, though, who is aware of his own sort of the way he governs, and is constantly concerned about preserving his own position. And one of the things that happens in the 1930s is that this state advances enormously in terms of its economy and its industrial capacity. But in terms of its ability to do other things, the state suffers. Because Stalin institutes a sort of, not just a cult of personality around himself, but starting in 1934, Stalin begins a whole series of purges of people in his inner circle, eventually expanding well beyond his inner circle to include hundreds of thousands of people who will either be killed after being tortured or be sent to gulags, where the majority of them will not survive for more than a year or two. It has to do a lot with Stalin's character, but also with, again, Stalin's sense that, ends justify the means. Stalin believed, and believed quite rightly, that there were people who did not like him. Stalin had, you might say, sort of a very significant streak of at least political paranoia in his character. And Stalin also believed that the most efficient way to rule, not the country at large, there you depended on propaganda and economic change, but in sort of proximity to those who assisted him and advised him and were around him, that you ruled through fear and uncertainty. And starting in the early 1930s, Stalin becomes convinced, oftentimes because the industrial takeoff, while it's dramatic, is not perhaps matching what he thinks it ought to be or where he thinks it ought to be. Stalin will begin to institute successive purges of the government, of the army, of his own party. Motivated by a desire to sort of keep people fearful, also at times to deflect attention from the failures within the state. That is, any sort of explosion in a mine, collapse of a factory, failure of a factory to meet production goals even. All of these things in the Soviet model get attributed not to bad luck or to poor planning or rushing designs or something like that. They all get attributed to sabotage and enemies, either internal or external, who are working to undermine the great Soviet experiment. And one of the things is this: as Stalin begins to purge people and he begins to focus on sort of eliminating his political enemies, he builds up this crazy momentum. That is, society around Stalin, or the sort of, you might almost say, the sort of the imperial court around Stalin, is so focused on its own politics that the purges start to take on a life of their own. Something Stalin seems to have intended, although it may have gone further than he had even believed it should. But you have this situation whereby Stalin will blame saboteurs or internal enemies or others for the failure of some piece of this economic development plan, or at least the slower achievement of it than he thinks is necessary or had forecast. It builds up this sense within the court that any sort of failure has to be immediately placed on someone else. That is, and so when there are failures, and then ultimately, even when there aren't failures, people start to preemptively denounce other people in the belief that it'll save themselves. The problem is, they create this system of permanent denunciation where denouncing someone is no guarantee of your own safety. It's this crazy world. But I mean, think about this. In 1937, Stalin commissions a population study of the Soviet Union. There are professional statisticians and demographers. They go out, they do sort of a census, and they come back and they say, look, in parts of this place, population is millions below what it ought to be. That is, these people, some of who had not known what had gone on in the Ukraine, have stumbled across what happened in the Ukraine. Their report says the Soviet Union is basically missing about 20 million people. Where the hell did they go? So Stalin has them all killed. And the report is actually not discovered until the early 1990s in the old Soviet archives. And people say, well, I wonder what happened to that guy. Well, now you know. But again, to displease Stalin was to, in essence, get it in the neck. So you build this culture up. And the thing is, Stalin is popular in the country. The propaganda machine is working. The economic transformation, even if it's sort of halting at times, is working. So Stalin has all this sort of freedom to initiate these purges. And people know that they can't quite take down Stalin. So what they've got to do is they've got to figure out how to survive Stalin. And there are reports, and these will be portrayed in films about Stalin, that sometimes they're true, sometimes they're sort of apocryphal. But Stalin would give a speech and everyone would applaud, and nobody wanted to be the first one to stop applauding. So you clap for 6 hours. What happens is, as I said, the Soviet state sort of turns on itself. The bureaucracy and the military, living in this atmosphere of sort of permanent denunciation. There were people who would denounce others to try to save themselves, and they would get to the police station, they would get to a detective or a high-ranking party member, and they'd say, I know that such and such is writing to or trying to correspond with Trotskyites outside of the state. And the person would say, well, that's very interesting. Why didn't you tell us sooner? And then all of a sudden your attempt to denounce turns you into the person who gets denounced because the person in the police or the intelligence agency or the bureaucracy, they said, oh, geez, if this is happening, I better find a way that I get on the right side of this. So you turn to the person and say, well, it took you a long time. This is very suspicious. We need you to come down for a few questions as well. It chews itself up, and Stalin sort of sets this process in motion. And the most terrifying thing about it is this. Over the course of the mid-1930s, about 1934 to 1938, a period in which at least 500,000 people are going to die in these purges, and probably an equal number are sent to the Gulag. You have a series of show trials in which people who had weeks before been sort of trusted lieutenants or trusted advisors, trusted generals or colonels in the military, appear before these courts. It's sort of a foregone conclusion what's going to happen, and they make these enormously elaborate confessions. They confess to everything. Yes, I was not home on, the 7th of March, 1934. I was in a cafe in Vienna meeting with Trotsky. Trotsky hadn't been in Vienna in 19 years. This person had actually been at home. But these people are there, and they're sort of calm. They're very willing to talk about their misdeeds. And this is really interesting to the people who see it. It's terrifying, in fact, to the people who see it. Because these people don't have a lot of marks on them. They don't look like they've been beaten. But they've been arrested 6 weeks previously, had occupied these positions of trust and authority and power. And now they're here confessing to these absurd accusations, or to these, ridiculous sounding charges. And they're doing so calmly. They're doing so in many cases because they're happy, because once they're done confessing, they'll be shot. And that will end what has happened to them over the previous 6, 8 weeks, sometimes several months. That is, something happens. There is torture going on. Torture works. Not to get you the truth, or, well, we used to call it torture, now we call it enhanced interrogation, because we've lost our way completely. But torture works. It doesn't work in getting you the truth. Torture gets the person tortured to say whatever you want them to say. And the Soviets in the 1930s mastered a lot of the arts of torture, especially of ways of torturing people without leaving hugely visible marks. Putting people in freezing rooms, having people stand for hours on end, injecting people with all sorts of chemicals that cause enormous pain, but didn't cause physical changes. They used camphor, which is one of the elements that's sometimes found in mothballs. They found that they injected that, it caused intense pain, but it didn't create any physical changes in people. It is a step above. In the early 1920s, and during the Russian Civil War, the early Soviet state had developed other means of torture. And those are oftentimes left much more visible marks. What you have in the 1930s is this regime which has worked very hard to figure out how to torture people without producing the marks. So that's the thing that's terrifying. You get these show trials, you get these purges, and people look at these people confessing so openly and freely, almost happily, to these ludicrous crimes. And it's they know that something's happened. And the question is, you don't know what's happened. And the only way you'll know what's happened is if something terrible happens to you. So you create this system where people are constantly denouncing each other, people are constantly turning on each other, no one trusts each other. And the result is that around Stalin, you have the decimation of the bureaucracy, the party leadership, and particularly the army. That is, the army is seen as a target where Stalin will support purges because the army is seen as a place that could possibly challenge Stalin significantly. What you have between roughly 1934 and 1939 is almost the complete change of the high command of the army. The people who are called the provosts of the army, the sort of highest ranking generals in the army. 6 of 8 out of them are either executed or sent to the Gulag. Thousands of lower ranking but still important army officers. People who, in many cases, had fought perhaps in the Civil War 15 years previously, Some of whom were people who had fought actually for the old Imperial Russian army and had then defected to the Bolsheviks, who had expertise. Not a lot of people in the Russian army had expertise, but some of them who did actually defected to the Bolsheviks in the late 1910s. They all start getting rounded up. The result is the army is in the hands of people who are relative incompetence. And by 1939, Stalin himself has realized this. That is, the purges stop by the end of 1938, the start of 1939, because Stalin is starting to worry about Hitler and about the threat that the Nazis pose to the Soviet Union. It's not hard to see what the threat is, and in fact, the Nazi plan is that they are going to take over the Soviet Union, enslave most of the people to work for them, make it sort of the breadbasket and industrial heartland in some places, or at least sort of mining and petroleum-producing heartland of the new Nazi empire. This realization that the state, the army, is not ready is what's going to lead Stalin in the summer of 1939 to shock the world and sign a non-aggression treaty with the Nazis. So you can see how this sort of builds. That is, the kind of state Stalin builds is very good at producing an advanced economy very quickly, but the violent nature of it, the suspicious nature of it that spurs this on, also winds up creating this culture of denunciation and stagnation at the center, at the heart of governance. And so in 1939, Stalin realizes he's dealing from a very weak position. This is the agreement in August 1939, whereby the Germans and Russians and the Soviets agree that they're, it's not going to go to war with each other. And the secret part of the agreement is we're going to divide Poland once the Nazis invade. Now, it's one of these strange agreements where both sides of the agreement have their fingers crossed throughout it. Because the Nazis are basically saying, we're going to do this, but this is just a prelude to get us, or a prelude to get us closer for a jumping off point for our invasion, ultimately, of the Soviet Union. The Soviets are like, this is a way for us to buy some time. And and it gives, in particular, Hitler this idea that getting through the Soviet Union is going to be pretty easy. It's a mistake he makes. But he thinks that, the Soviets are in this position of weakness. And in late 1939, after the Soviets have helped the Germans carve up Poland, Stalin, sort of thinking that, he's going to need to try out his military more, need to get them more experience, to train them to, face the Germans eventually, Stalin actually invades Finland and tries to take back part of Finland. Finland had been part of old Imperial Russia, but had sort of been partitioned off after the First World War. He wants to take part of southern Finland back. This starts in December 1939, and the war continues for about 5 months. And it's a complete fiasco. The Soviet army ultimately wins only because, in the grand old Russian tradition, they have more Soviets to throw at the problem than anyone else. But they go out there, the army is ill-equipped, it's ill-trained. The Finns do things like, for example, if you're going to fight in winter, why don't you ski? And they use cross-country skis to get around. And even though, fundamental, fashion transgression, it's not yet Memorial Day, but the Finns all wear white. And they fight in the snow, and they're camouflaged. The Russians are out there in green and brown. The political officers and the generals have these red tabs and elaborate sort of badges on their caps that make them easy targets for Finnish snipers. Ultimately, the Finns are defeated, but it takes a huge toll. And it further convinces the Germans that the Soviets are going to roll right over when the Germans invade. There is this, as I said, this sort of sclerosis, this stagnation at the heart of Soviet government. And even in 1941, Stalin is aware of this, but he's not taking as many steps to sort of build up his army as he can. In the spring of 1941, the Germans are massing millions of men, ultimately 3 million, on the border of Soviet-occupied Poland, or the Soviet half of Poland. They're going to invade. They have defectors. German soldiers defect or desert flee to Soviet lines and they say, do you see all this? This is not a joke. We're not here just because we thought this was a nice place to park all the tanks. But this is the situation. Stalin's created this crazy world in which no one wants to tell him about this. Because Stalin had confidently predicted to the Politburo and to his advisors, he said, Hitler won't come before the middle of 1942. He's not strong enough. So there you are, May, June 1941, absolutely overwhelming evidence that the Nazis are coming, and probably coming pretty soon. And no one wants to tell Stalin. The idea is, you tell me, you tell me. Even when the Nazis actually invade in June 1941, there was hesitation. There are people who, the tanks are literally rolling past their window. And they're handing each other the phone. You tell me, you tell me, you tell me. Nobody, it's like something out of a situation comedy. And Stalin knows this. When Stalin hears about this invasion, finally, this brave person calls, Stalin actually goes off to his country house, his dacha, in the woods, because he says, well, that's it for me. I said, the invasion's not coming for another year, year and a half. He thinks the rest of the world, or the rest of Soviet society, is going to play by his rules. He says, I'm going to go sit in my dacha. They're probably going to come and shoot me. It's been a nice run, but there you go. And then he sits there, and nobody comes. And eventually, a few members of his cabinet come, and they say, Stalin, you must save us. At which point Stalin says, what do I need to do? Or what can't I do? And manage to ride it out. Stalin comes back. They free all of these soldiers and all of these generals and all of these higher-ranking officers who've been imprisoned in the Gulag. They get them all out. Tell them, guess what? It's time to fight the Germans. It's and Stalin sort of rides it out. It's crazy in some respects. Stalin spends 3 years being absolutely wrong about everything about the Nazis. And for that, he is told he must save the Soviet Union from the situation he got them in previously. So it's a demonstration that, and the reason that the Soviets are able to fight the Nazis so effectively is in many ways due to everything that happens in the 1930s. In the first place, the Soviets have an enormous industrial capacity. They have a population which, through all of this, is still very willing to follow Stalin and to die for Stalin. Stalin as sort of the leader, Stalin as the sort of stand-in for the state. There's also this. The Soviets wouldn't have been in this situation. In fact, the Soviets are sort of a beneficiary because Stalin so mismanages the army, causes so much chaos within the state, that the Nazis are overconfident. When they invade in June 1941, they think 3 months tops. They don't pack winter clothes. They don't pack antifreeze for their tanks. So you get to October, which in the Soviet Union, in Russia, it's when winter starts. And they're stuck. So this combination, in some ways, Stalin's own incompetence saves him because it convinces the Nazis that he's not going to be that hard to defeat. And by the time the Nazis get bogged down, because Stalin is able to resist just a little bit longer than they think he will. Remember, there are still millions of Soviet soldiers. The Soviet Union still has this industrial capacity. Ultimately, the Soviet Union is able to survive. So it's this combination of what Stalin builds up in the 1930s, resources, a sense of loyalty to the state that is absolutely unshakable, and then the fact that Stalin's behavior and the internal politics of the Soviet Union in the 1930s help contribute to this idea that it's going to be a pushover for the Germans. When you combine all of these, that's how the Soviets ultimately survive and are going to fight, the bloodiest part of the Second World War. Compared to what goes on between the Germans and the Soviets, D-Day, the invasion of North Africa, the invasion of Italy, not to trivialize them, but they are sideshows compared to the big thing. The Second World War in Europe is won between Berlin and Moscow, or Berlin and Stalingrad, you might say, in a vicious and brutal, almost sort of animalistic conflict that consumes millions of men, and the ramifications which are still being felt today. So you have, again, Stalin creates this state that is on the one hand to many in the outside world, to many who don't know much about it. On the one hand, is this economic and industrial triumph. On the other hand, he creates something like the old court of the Tsar. A book about Stalin's way of governing is called that the court of the Red Tsar. That is, secret police, prison camps, incompetence, rewarded with promotion because of favoritism or because of just sheer luck or denunciations. In many ways, the Russian Revolution has gone 360 degrees. You're back where you started. You've got an autocratic regime that, at least initially, isn't very efficient at protecting itself, and that ultimately, in some ways, is bailed out by, among other things, its own incompetence. It looks a lot like the Tsarist regime of 1913, 1914. There are factories, people wear different uniforms, everybody's calling each other comrade, but underneath, it's a similar thing we talked about with Meiji Japan. There is this continuity. And the continuity is built in from the start of the Russian Revolution. That is, the way in which Lenin says this revolution must proceed. That it must be revolution first, led by a small group, a dictatorship. Then you will have the transformation. That sort of style of revolution builds in, you might say, almost a rationale for permanent dictatorship. That Lenin's determination that the ends are the most important things. How you get there doesn't matter. It means that for people like Stalin, anything is seen as justified on the road to a certain goal. So you have this climate of violence, of fear, of political paranoia, this notion that you were engaged in a permanent revolution, which justifies the permanent continuation of this dictatorship by the few. All of these things are built into the Russian Revolution at the start. And in some ways, Stalin is both the fulfillment of that revolution, in terms of what he produces, but in terms of also how his state operates. And he's also, you might say, a symbol of just how much continuity there remains in the Soviet Union, or the transition from Russia to the Soviet Union. You go from one sort of autocracy to another. And if you look carefully, the similarities are oftentimes almost sort of staggering once they're understood. All right, let's do a lot today. We'll cut this short today. We'll start talking soon about the Middle East, actually. And then we'll be reading about the day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, again, the day in the life of a prisoner in the Gulag, in Stalin's Gulag. All right, thank you.